Lesson 18 asks the question, how has the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment changed the Constitution? So I'll ask, can you tell us what is due process of law, what important values and interests are protected by it, and where did the idea even come from?
So I'll start with the last part. The idea of due process goes all the way back to the Magna Carta and maybe even before that. Exactly what due process is a harder question to answer because due process has evolved to mean a lot of different things in American jurisprudence. At its core, I think due process is about treating people respectfully and equally under the law and subject to some kind of regularized processes that make people feel that they're not being kind of dissed because of who they are or who their parents were or their station in life.
Where in the Constitution can I find due process?
Due process has formal recognition in the Fifth Amendment and then again in the 14th Amendment, both of which say government shall not deprive any individual life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So they don't say that the government cannot deprive us of life, liberty, or property, but that if government's going to do that, it has to treat us in a particularly procedurally respectful way.
Since due process was already in the Fifth Amendment, why was it included in the 14th, and what's been the ramifications of that?
All of the first 8 amendments, including the Fifth Amendment, when originally written and enacted, limited only the federal government. And that made sense because the federal government was the new, scary kid on the block when the Constitution was created. So the original first 8 amendments did not impose any limits on state or local government, and that's true of the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. It regulated only the federal government. After the Civil War, 14th Amendment is adopted, and it imposes on states and their subdivisions, localities, counties, the same due process requirements that the federal government had to live under by virtue of the 14th Amendment. So it really extends due process from the federal to the state arenas.
Can you talk about specifically procedural due process and what its essential elements are?
So procedural due process is the most natural kind of due process to think about. The word process and procedure are obviously tightly related. So procedural due process involves things like notice. If something's going to happen to you, you have to be notified that it's going to happen. An opportunity to be heard. So before you have property or liberty taken away from you, or certainly after you've had it taken away from you, you have to be given a chance to give your side of things. It requires that there be a neutral and detached decision maker, someone who's not bribed or who has some cause in the case. You have to be able to present evidence on your behalf. Sometimes you have to be able to hire an advocate, an attorney, or someone like an attorney to help you. Sometimes you have to be given a list of reasons for why your arguments were or were not accepted. You have to be able to confront people who have negative things or evidence to offer about you. It's a body of fairness ideals that at the core of which is kind of the opportunity to present one's case and have it resolved by an unbiased decision maker, whether that's a judge or a jury.
Many of the references you just made are to trials. So let me ask, is procedural due process primarily something involved in criminal proceedings or in all different kinds of proceedings?
It is involved in criminal proceedings in court, it's involved in non-criminal or civil proceedings in court, and it's involved even outside of court. There's a famous Supreme Court case from the 1970s called Matthews versus Eldridge that says whenever the government has or is threatening to deprive someone of life, liberty, or property, we have to decide what kinds of procedures are appropriate or due in that case. And it's a function of 3 factors. One is how much the individual stands to lose. So if your life is at stake, if it's a capital defense case, then we provide more procedures than if it's something less weighty. Next, we decide how much additional procedures might enhance the accuracy of the ultimate decision, how much additional information or deliberation will improve the ultimate decision that is made. And then third, because we live in the real world, we have to ask what the cost of the additional procedures would be. So, for example, in a death penalty case, as I mentioned, due process operates at its extreme. We have state-appointed lawyers, automatic appeals, long trials, a lot of procedure. At the other end of the spectrum, let's say your public library card is going to be revoked. You're entitled to some procedure there, but it's much more minimalistic. Maybe you don't get the procedure before the card is revoked, you get it afterward. And maybe you don't get a big full-blown hearing. All you're entitled to is a letter explaining that the reason your card was revoked is you have 10 overdue books and you're not paying the fines. But anytime government is taking away your property, whether it's your public job, whether it's your home in eminent domain, or your liberty in a criminal case, then due process is calibrated to make sure that you receive an amount of process that is fair under the circumstances.
You just mentioned property a few times. What is meant by the term property in the Due Process Clause?
So the due process clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendment don't define property, but instead they incorporate or pick up a definition of property that comes from state law. So every state protects and defines property in slightly different ways. In every state, real property, that is land, is considered part of property. And in modern days, intellectual property, so that's copyright, trademark, patent, those are very important kinds of property because today wealth is generated by ideas as much as by dirt and land. But there are other things that fall within certain states' definition of properties as well, like public employment or public benefits or public privileges like a driver's license. And whether something counts as property depends in part on the messages that state law sends to people about whether their entitlement to something is as a matter of governmental whim or is regularized and is supposed to endure.